It started like any other flight, passengers boarding, overhead bins filling, and a sense of routine in the air. But what unfolded next was anything but ordinary. In the middle of a bustling cabin, a tense moment escalated between a flight attendant and a man quietly seated in first class. Without warning, the flight attendant reached for her pepper spray, her actions sparking chaos and confusion among the passengers. What could have caused such an extreme reaction? As the situation spiraled, the man calmly revealed a truth that left everyone speechless. He wasn't just any passenger. He was the owner of the very airline they were flying on. The stunned silence that followed raised even more questions. What had led to this misunderstanding, and how would the flight crew, and the man himself, respond to this shocking turn of events? Stay tuned to find out what happened next. As the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet, passengers exchanged confused glances, whispering about what they had just witnessed. The man, still composed despite the chaos, wiped his eyes and calmly stated, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." His voice carried no anger, just a quiet authority that made everyone stop and pay attention. The flight attendant, visibly shaken, stammered, You weren't supposed to be here." "I thought," she trailed off, her face pale as realization began to dawn. What had she assumed about him? Why had she acted so rashly? Passengers who had initially sided with her began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some were still too stunned to speak. Others looked at the man with curiosity, wondering how he had ended up in this position. Meanwhile, the man's calm demeanor only deepened the mystery. Who was he, really, and what would happen when the truth fully came to light? Got it. Here's a continuation of the story with more depth, subplots, and a suspenseful tone. The narrow alley stretched ahead, shrouded in a fog that seemed to cling to the cracked brick walls. Emma's footsteps were light, careful, but every sound she made felt amplified in the stillness. She stopped, straining her ears. For a moment, there was nothing. Then faintly, the sound of hurried breathing reached her. Someone was close, too close. Her fingers tightened around the small, worn notebook in her hand, the one that had caused everything to unravel. She glanced behind her, catching a flicker of movement in the shadows. Whoever it was, they weren't bothering to hide their presence anymore. Emma's pulse quickened, and she ducked into a side street, pressing herself against the wall. Her mind raced. She had read the entries in the notebook only once, but it was enough to understand why so many people wanted it, why they were willing to kill for it. A low hum caught her attention. She turned her head slightly, peeking around the corner. A black car idled at the end of the street, its tinted windows giving nothing away. It had been following her since she left the library. She didn't know who was inside, but she had a pretty good guess. Across town, Victor paced the length of his cluttered apartment, his phone pressed to his ear. "I told you I'd handle it," he snapped, his voice sharp but low. His gaze drifted to the stack of documents on his coffee table, the edges curling as if they had been handled too many times. "No, you don't understand. If she leaks this, if anyone sees what's in that notebook, it's over. For all of us." He ended the call abruptly and ran a hand through his hair. There was no use pretending he wasn't in over his head. When he first agreed to work with them, it seemed simple enough, just another job, another paycheck. But now, with every hour that passed, the weight of his choices bore down on him like an anvil. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of the city, a man in a gray hoodie sat hunched over a laptop. His fingers flew across the keys, pulling up file after file. He paused, staring at a photo of Emma, her face illuminated by the faint glow of the screen. A soft chuckle escaped him, humorless and cold. "You've got no idea what you're holding, do you?" he muttered under his breath. Back in the alley, Emma's breathing slowed as she willed herself to stay calm. She had to think. The notebook wasn't just a collection of scribbles. It was a map, one that led to something bigger than she could comprehend. Every instinct told her to destroy it, to toss it into the nearest fire, and walk away. But she couldn't. Not after what she'd seen, not after what it had already cost her. The sound of approaching footsteps broke her reverie. Emma pressed herself tighter against the wall, clutching the notebook to her chest. She could feel her heart pounding, hear it in her ears. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Emma, her name was spoken softly, almost gently, but she didn't move. She knew that voice. She closed her eyes, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and anger. When she finally turned, her eyes met his. Victor stood a few feet away, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "You have to trust me," he said. She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Trust you? After everything?" Victor took a cautious step forward, his gaze flicking to the notebook in her hands. "I didn't have a choice. None of us did. But you can still get out of this. Give it to me, Emma. Let me fix this." Her grip on the notebook tightened. "Fix it? You're part of this mess, Victor. You think I don't know that?" Before he could respond, the distant hum of the black car's engine grew louder, the sound cutting through the tension like a knife. Victor's expression shifted, panic flashing across his face. "Emma, we don't have time." "They're coming." She hesitated, her mind racing. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but something in Victor's eyes made her pause. There was fear, yes, but also something else. Desperation, maybe even regret. The car came into view, its headlights piercing through the fog. Emma's jaw tightened. She didn't know who to trust anymore, but one thing was certain. She wasn't about to let the notebook fall into the wrong hands. Without a word, she turned and bolted down the alley, the notebook clutched tightly to her chest. Victor swore under his breath and followed her, the sound of the car's engine roaring behind them. Somewhere in the chaos, Emma couldn't help but wonder if she was running toward safety or straight into another trap. The night felt darker now, as if the shadows themselves were closing in. Emma's legs burned as she ran, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She could hear Victor behind her, his footsteps heavy and urgent. The sound of the car's engine grew louder, the low rumble cutting through the still air. She didn't dare look back. They reached the edge of the alley, and Emma skidded to a stop, her shoes scraping against the pavement. The street ahead was empty, save for the dim glow of a single street lamp flickering above. Her eyes darted around, searching for any sign of cover, an escape route, anything. Victor caught up to her, grabbing her arm. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and strained. "There's a warehouse 2 blocks from here. We can hide there. But you have to trust me, Emma, please." She yanked her arm free, glaring at him. "Why should I trust you? For all I know, you're leading me straight to them." Victor's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked like he might argue. But then his expression softened, and he said quietly, "Because I'm the only one who knows how this ends if you don't." Emma hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't have time to debate. The sound of car doors slamming shut reached her ears, followed by the unmistakable crunch of boots on gravel. They were close, too close. "Fine," she said, her voice sharp. "But if you try anything—" "I won't," Victor interrupted, his tone firm. "I promise." Without another word, they took off down the street, their footsteps echoing in the quiet. The warehouse came into view, a hulking structure with broken windows and rusted metal doors. Victor led the way, pushing open a side door that creaked loudly in protest. They slipped inside, the heavy darkness swallowing them whole. Emma's eyes adjusted slowly, and she took in the space around her. The warehouse was vast, filled with towering shelves and scattered debris. The air was thick with the smell of dust and oil. She moved toward a stack of crates, crouching low as Victor followed. "Now what?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Victor didn't answer right away. He was peering through a crack in the wall, his body tense. "They'll search here," he said finally. "But they won't find us right away. We just need to buy some time." "Time for what?" Emma asked, her frustration mounting. Victor turned to her, his expression grim. "To figure out our next move, and to make sure that notebook doesn't fall into their hands." Emma's grip on the notebook tightened. "You still haven't told me what's in here that's so important. What are they after?" Victor hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. "It's not just a map," he said quietly. "It's proof. Proof of everything they've done, every lie, every cover-up. If this gets out," he trailed off, his eyes meeting hers, "it'll change everything." Before Emma could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Her breath caught in her throat as she pressed herself against the crates. Victor motioned for her to stay quiet, his finger pressed to his lips.